Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to today's panel. Appreciate that synthesis from Michael Moe, and clearly this is our panel on AI, and what an exciting time this is. I'm so glad you've all joined us for this panel discussion today. By way of introduction, my name is Gordon Jones. I'm the founding dean of the College of Innovation and Design at Boise State University, a 25,000 person regional public university located in the Northwest US in Boise, Idaho. I want to welcome you to today's panel, this ASU GSV panel titled AI Transforming Higher Learning, where we have a group of experts assembled who've graciously agreed to spend time in sharing their perspectives and insights from across their various purviews. We have 5 panelists I'd like to briefly introduce to you. As an aside, I recommend any of you watching today, if you're interested in each panelist's detailed background, I encourage you to look that up. I'll be providing really a cursory intro for each. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have with us Shravan, Goli, our Chief Product Officer at Coursera, Stephanie Butler, Senior Director of Product Management at Turnitin, Burr, the founder and leader of AI and Machine Learning Group at Duolingo, Nuno Frenandes, the CEO of Alumno and Higher Education Partners, and Matthew Rascoff, Associate Vice Provost for Digital Education and Innovation at Duke University. So welcome, panelists. So a bit of a preamble before we jump in. So this is a global audience that's listening today. So I want to presume very little and yet be excited about all the potential of this topic. So with that, what is AI and machine learning? How are they impacting learning today, from higher education to adult learning, both domestically and internationally? What are the trends? Which ones are real? And I hope to explore today which ones might be perhaps premature or even smoke. We'll take a moment to discuss both specific examples of where AI is being used today and how it is transforming or holds the promise to transform our learning environments and more broadly, industries, not least of which is the education industry. So much ground to cover, yet we have limited time. So I'd like to cut over now to our panelists and start our discussion. If you don't mind, I'd like to turn to you, Shravan. I think as the Chief Product Officer of Coursera, you're someone who sits at an interesting intersection of both learners, industry, content providers. I'd love it if you'd share with our listeners today perhaps a landscape view on AI, machine learning, how it's affecting this industry, where it sits today. And I appreciate you willing to kick us off. So over to you, Shravan.
All right. Well, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, the attendees, as well as thank you, ASU GSV, for the opportunity. And also welcome to the esteemed panelists. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to kick it off, Gordon. Overall, AI is a powerful tool, and that's why you're here and listening to this panel. It can help both individuals and organizations move forward. But from an education perspective, the data and the insights we get from AI can be a game changer, especially for those moving on into online learning. But I do believe we're just scratching the surface, because if you step back for a second and you can actually say, AI can help solve much bigger problems and a lot of macro issues in society and education. I see this falling into 2 main trends. The first trend is around how AI can help individuals and organizations learn the skills of the future to remain relevant amid the rise of automation. We all know, we heard from various McKinsey reports and other reports that low-skilled jobs are at the highest risk of automation. And in fact, pandemic actually accelerated the risk of automation around sort of these kinds of jobs. So with AI tools, we can actually empower the individuals to discover and learn and showcase appropriate job relevant skills. So for example, in our case, I'll just do a very quick example here, Coursera Skills Graph. Using machine learning, we identify the skills trends and the gaps and benchmark for thousands of companies and millions of learners. And then ultimately, we're able to guide the learners as a result to the right content that teaches those right skills as required for either they're trying to upskill or find new careers. Second trend, the big trend, I would say, is how AI can help improve equity in higher education and drive a more inclusive learning experience. So when I look at the technology like AI, how it can help actually lower the cost of education by enabling educators to teach at scale. It can be faster, it can be more efficient. Of course, it comes with its challenges, but one of the key examples that we use on the MOOCs front, we have over 70 million registered learners who are coming to Coursera every year. They're going through this over 4,000 courses of content, but they're making an attempt about 100 million questions as a result. And so part of that is we are able to provide these machine-assisted peer review. So when learners are actually taking these assessments and they're submitting, there aren't enough individuals out there who can actually review their assessment. So through the machine learning and machine-assisted peer review system, we can actually help the educators with the grading that needed to be done there. The AI can also help guide and support learners to driving increased engagement and retention for learners at every skill level. So as you think about ultimately, one of the big areas of opportunity is how do we ensure the learners are having the motivation to go through the learning experience and actually acquire those skills. So we've invested once again in sort of the machine learning to help through what we call as in-course coach and providing smart review interventions. So when somebody is actually failing in a particular test, we can actually say, hey, go back and review this material one more time. And so these are just very, very small nascent examples, I would say. There's a lot that can be done. So I feel like these innovations are like just at the beginning. I know it has demonstrated a lot of promising potential, and I'd love to see a lot more impact in the future years.
That's really neat. I appreciate hearing about sort of your thoughts of the precision, the ability for this to cover two particular areas. Clearly, individuals skilling up and the potential for education deployment in a way to increase engagement. I'm curious, Matthew, maybe I could turn to you. You being at Duke University, at a university environment, any additional commentary on either the landscape or ways in which the university, any trends you see the university environment with AI?
Thank you, Gordon, and really glad to be here with you and the other panelists and the participants in ASU GSV this year. Thank you for including me in this. Yeah, I mean, to me, the AI in education question kind of exemplifies the promise and perils of ed tech writ large. And it, in some ways, kind of exacerbates some of the highs and lows that you see in this industry. So like on the one hand, you see edX getting 30% more engagement using machine learning driven nudges in their courses, which was a result that was published last year, which is pretty amazing. But on the other hand, we have all these concerns about surveillance, bias, and privacy when it comes to AI-driven proctoring, which I think has a lot of ethical issues that are still to be worked out. And the black box nature of some of the algorithms, I think, makes it really hard to work out those questions in the commons, which is how academia works through its issues in professional societies and in conferences and in peer-reviewed papers. So I do think there's something of a conflict between the way this stuff is built and the way it's implemented. And I see that in my role at Duke, where it's really hard, I think, to distinguish what's real and what's not. Where are the authentic opportunities for making a big impact of the kind that Shravan was talking about? And Duke is, of course, is a big Coursera partner, so we're thrilled to be part of that advancement. But also, make sure we're not over investing and over optimistic and then missing out on the good stuff. So I think there's kind of a snake oil problem in any advanced technology, and at the forefront of this field, it's pretty hard, I think, to know what's real and what's not and to sort those things out. So I do have some thoughts about how the field can make progress, but I do see that's kind of the balance that I see emerging right now. And I think our whole industry is trying to work through how do you strike the balance and how do you get some of the good and make sure we're filtering out the stuff that we don't want.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think we all agree this is at the early stages of this curve. Although I'm happy to have panelists disagree, but this idea of the promise of what's real, what's not, there's so many different, I like to think a lot about these things are tools for a job. I think you used the word tool, Shravan. It's not the panacea to everything. Perhaps I could throw this open to our other panelists here. Either more broadly, could you share with our listening audience what problems is AI and machine learning well suited for today? And perhaps you even have examples. Would Stephanie, perhaps you have a thought, and then I'd throw it open to Burr and Nuno.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a really key question. How can you make AI into a set of tools that's truly valuable to the people who are going to engage with them and use them? And so one of the things I really like to think about, because AI is so new, and honestly, we're always kind of moving the marker of what is AI. Grammar checkers used to be considered AI. Now they're kind of just these dumb little tools that we have at our disposal. So when we say AI, it's we're always moving the goalpost. And so how mature is AI? How mature is it not? Is a tough question to answer. But when I think about building tools using AI, for me, one of the important things I think about, and this goes to Shravan's observation about scaling educators, is how do I make a tool that's going to facilitate learning and in fact potentially facilitate the interaction between an instructor and a learner, or a piece of content and a learner? Because at the end of the day, AI is pretty far away from being completely accurate about the performance of a student or the performance of an instructor or the accuracy of a piece of content. But what it's very good at doing is helping an instructor see the full picture of the student, to see many different data points aggregated together, and help the student see those data points about themselves, and to start pointing them in directions where they need to focus. And that's where you can really start to get really, really rich interactions between a teacher and a student. Not that you couldn't do that before, but everyone comes to the table with a lot more now. So when I look at some of the, one of the tools that I worked on on the past, which is not a higher ed tool primarily, but it provided feedback to students while they were doing their writing. You click a button, you get feedback. And one of the biggest impacts we saw of that was you had 12-year-olds walking up to their teacher and saying, well, how do I make a better thesis? Instead of throwing a paper on the desk and saying, I don't know what to do. All of a sudden they can have a much more rich interactive conversation that's more focused on what they need. And I think you're seeing that in the higher ed space as well, with things like products like Gradescope, which are fundamentally efficiency tools that use computer vision to help instructors grade open-ended questions as fast as you can do a multiple choice Scantron test. But now the students get richer feedback because the instructors had more time. They don't have to sift through so many different pieces of paper. They can do things much more quickly. That gives them more ability to give feedback, and it gives students that transparency and that understanding of where they are right now. And so that's what I really think is key to where we are right now, is enriching those learning opportunities that exist and making them more driven towards the outcomes that we want our students to achieve throughout their higher education journey.
Nuno, let me push over to you, because I think you're operating outside of the U.S. I'm curious, what's your take with higher ed institutions and their level of adoption? How are they seeing it? And perhaps build off of what Stephanie shared.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, ASU+GSV, for the invitation. Absolutely. We've been experimenting with AI for a while. I do agree with the fact that we're just at the very beginning. This is just starting. We're all learning. It's a lot of trial and error and learning by doing. We've been successful, I would say, more successful with the fact that we've been using AI to prevent and to improve the retention rate of our students. So to work with the variables we know and to improve the retention rates of our students, especially in online education. So we know there's a set of variables that are relevant, such as if the student is paying on time, if the student has good academic performance, if the student interacts with the platform, if the student interacts with the teacher assistants, and so forth. And we have defined a set of about 20 variables, and it works pretty well. And we've been having very strong results, and we've increased about 3 or 4 points the retention rate versus what we had before. Now, where AI still does not work is what I call, the big life changes. that you cannot predict. So for example, you cannot predict COVID. You cannot predict that somebody gets divorced. You cannot predict that somebody loses a job, or you cannot predict that somebody has a health problem. So it works very well with the variables that you can control in a way, or that you can predefine. It still doesn't work very well with the variables that you cannot control, which in the end are very relevant for retention, right? So we've been improving the algorithms, and we've been working with schools outside the US. And like I said, we've had very good results, and we have very good results, but it's a lot of learning by doing, and that's what we're still are working on, is to keep developing and perfecting these algorithms.
It's really interesting on this idea of persistence and the ability for AI to come alongside that, both in the classroom and I assume outside the classroom. Burr, I'm wondering if you might be willing to share with us, either specifically from a Duolingo perspective or just from a technology perspective, either comments about persistence and how Duolingo is sort of managing that and how well that's working. And I also have maybe an add-on question. Is AI or machine learning, is this meant to be a replacement for teachers or augmenting the teacher, or in some cases, either or?
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, so just to sort of follow up on, I wholly agree with what Stephanie and Nuno were just saying, that AI can be useful for learning analytics and providing additional tools to classroom instructors and tutors to help them get, a broader or actually a more fine-grained view at how students are doing. But those are students who are fortunate enough to be in a classroom situation to begin with. I don't believe that anybody, and certainly Duolingo is not in the business of creating AI to replace good human tutors. The best way you can learn a language is with a one-on-one language tutor, but most of the people in the world don't have access to that. And so we believe that AI is one of the best ways to scale that kind of experience to anybody, regardless of where you're from or what your life story is. And then if you take that sort of approach and you think about what makes a good teacher, there are lots of things, but I claim there's at least 3 properties. One is that they know the content really well. Another is that they know how to keep you engaged and interested, in that content. And 3, because of the one-on-one interaction they get with you, they can get inside your head and sort of understand what you're getting, what you're not getting, what you've forgotten. Like a lot of educational AI is aimed at either assessment, which is one point in time, or like a semester long, which is a shorter point of time. But for lifelong learning, you learn more things, you're not practicing certain things, you're forgetting things. And so all of those need to be baked into it. So at Duolingo, which is an online learning app with 300 million users or so, we have AI projects in each of those 3 areas. Tools to help our content experts develop comprehensive and high quality content that's aligned to a standard, like the Common European or Framework of Reference for Languages. Tools to keep students engaged, which many platforms, I think there was a mention of the edX results earlier, like using banded algorithms and other kinds of things to sort of increase engagement with the students. And then perhaps most importantly, based on this one-on-one interaction, the machine and the students, in the case of an app like ours, we get 500 million data points a day of students doing exercises and what they got right and what they got wrong, and which of those contained concepts that they last saw 6 months ago. So I think we've had a lot of success, I think, using those approaches. There was actually, just recently, there was an efficacy study, if you go to duolingo.com/efficacy, showing that, I forgot how many hours, but about 25 or 30 skills in Duolingo is equivalent to 4 university semesters. That's sort of for the instruction side. And since this is a panel on higher ed, there's also the topic of standardized testing to be admitted into university programs. So we also have a product called the Duolingo English Test, which is the first digital first sort of test. And we use AI to generate adaptively administer and automatically score, as well as assist in the proctoring. It's not, there's still human review at every single step of the way, but we use AI to help with that throughput. And when the world kind of shut down with COVID, it was basically the only English language test available to many people in the world who wanted to then advance their careers by studying in English speaking universities in the United States, UK, and Canada, and other places.
Well, I think what's interesting, and I think certainly our participants watching will see this is a panel with a broad spectrum working across learners, independent of institutions, academic institutions, and then those of us that are more in these institutions. I'm wondering if any or multiple panelists might want to comment on how do we talk about adoption of AI? Where are we in this? You, Burr, just brought up, for example, there's elements that have worked their way in that we may not even realize, and then there's more wholesale AI, machine learning type, fully deployed product. I don't know if, Shravan, if you have a perspective on sort of how might you talk about adoption and perhaps more broadly, where are we in this curve of AI and machine learning?
Yeah, I think if I think about just in terms of the domain itself, right? So we look at from a content standpoint and the education side of the equation. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of development in terms of starting with sort of just introduction to machine learning to all the way to now deep learning and neural networks and computer vision. And so I think there's an element of, first and foremost, if you just kind of follow the mobile wave and the cloud wave, all of these things take time. And I think, we've talked about the AI wave in the 90s too. I remember in my master's program doing AI courses and thinking, it was like, this is too theoretical and this is never going to result in something meaningful. But I think, AI is going to take a lot longer than just as I think about mobile and the cloud wave in terms of a broader adoption and broader use cases. But there are lots of examples that are emerging in a lot of different industries. If you just take automotive as an example, self-driving cars are not there yet, but I use the autopilot on Tesla as an example. It saves it saves me from a mundane task sometimes, stuck in a traffic when you have bumper to bumper traffic. The risk of letting the car drive itself is pretty reasonably low, so I just get to use it at that time. So to me, I think there are similar analogies exist in terms of higher education. I think there's a lot of these tasks that machines could assist and help. I think both on the learner side and on the educator side, on the faculty and the TA, all of that stuff. So for me, I think it is time that we continue to invest and we continue to develop these application experiences. But to Matthew's point, I think we need to make sure all the ecosystem participants are part of it. It's not like us, technology company, going off and doing this on the side and then just coming in and sort of like, oh, let's apply this. I think this is a challenge where you want to continue to involve all the different participants. And that's how I think it's going to get to a higher level and faster level of adoption. It accounts for some of the privacy laws or ethical biases that you need to take into account and things like that as well.
Other panelists want to share?
I would like to comment on Shravan because I agree 100%. I think it's going to take a while to be mainstream, but I think eventually it will be mainstream in certain areas of the industry. Higher education, in some cases, sometimes many cases, moves slower than other industries because it's a highly regulated environment, and that's fine. It's just what it is. And because it's so regulated, it's not that easy to transform. But I do believe that AI will eventually transform the learning experience, will eventually transform the teaching experience, and will eventually transform the economics of higher education. Now, I'm talking about maybe decades. It moves very slow, but certainly it will. There's an idea that I particularly appreciate with AI, which is the idea of adaptive learning, where the idea behind it is the fact that every person is different and learns in a different way. And if that's true, then why is the curriculum the same for every student? Why is the curriculum not being adapted to the profile of that student along the way? And I think that's a very powerful idea, because if I like to listen more and some other student likes to learn, to read more, and some other student has another way of learning, then the curriculum should be adapted to the profile of each student to maximize the student experience. And that idea, I believe, is very powerful because in the end, it's not that different to what we see with social media, to what we see with Netflix, with Amazon, where when you go to your profile, it shows what that specific platform believes it's better for you, that it fits your profile. So when it comes to the curriculum of a particular university, I think that AI will be very powerful to create curriculums that are custom made for each individual student. And I think that is very powerful. But again, like Shravan said, it will take a long time before we get that. But that particular idea, I believe, it's very strong.
Well, let's talk about objections or concerns, and I want to direct this question to Stephanie and then maybe Matthew. I'd be curious, what do you think most frightens or unsettles people about AI in education, the educators or the administrators? And how do you think we either might allay those fears, or are they warranted? And I'd love to hear your commentaries.
I think there's a couple different, sort of core fears that come through pretty frequently, particularly amongst educators, administrators as well. And I think the first one is sort of obvious, which is your job. We've moved from this world where technology takes sort of basic rote work and automates it to a world in which technology is starting to encroach on intellectual work, on intellectual life and effort and creative work. And you see that in many different places, not just education. There's technology out there right now that will write code for you. So the computer programs the computer itself. And, I think you hear from a lot of people in software that that's their creative world, so they're kind of messing with it. And you see similar things happening in education, the fear around computers or technology taking over the world of the teacher. So I think that's the first thing. I think another thing is, particularly in the Western tradition of higher education, the idea of academic freedom is incredibly important. And that freedom comes to what you spend your time researching, what you publish, how you publish it, who you work with. And of course, also your classroom, the topics you decide are relevant for your students, how you craft the learning experience for them. And as we start to talk about personalization and curriculum and content, you start to get into a tough place for educators a lot of the time, because it sort of starts to encroach on that academic freedom that they have. So those are sort of like the two things that I sort of hear about a lot, and I'm sure Matthew has many more. But to kind of finish answering the question in terms of how to allay fears, it's tricky. But I think that one of the things we really focus on is how can we build tools that help educators? Put AI aside, how do we make it easier for educators to have more time putting their energy where they need to, be it their research or their teaching or their content development or their writing? And how do we do that in a way that is effective no matter what the technology we put behind it is? So it might be AI, it might just be a better workflow that we've created through a digital mechanism. It might be a combination of those things. It might be an insight that we can give you in a second, instead of you having to Google a bunch of things to figure out if a student, used the citation correctly. So that's sort of one of the core ways that we kind of address this. Is our goal is not to replace educators. Our job is to create tools that allow educators to do their job to the best of their ability. And I think that that's sort of the main way, that the main lever we have to pull, is that it's about tools, not about replacement.
Matthew.
I mean, I think that really resonates with me, Stephanie, and that's definitely a message that we have tried to convey to instructors at Duke too. And I think you summarized the concerns well. What I would say to those who are building AI, though, for education right now is I've got kind of some advice for you for how to go in with a message that will resonate with people and will get a more positive response. I think, augmenting the instructor and not replacing them is absolutely key. And I think that message is now consistent across all of us. And I've got kind of an example for each of these. And my example for that is this fantastic app called Elsa. And ELSA it's a language accent improvement app that was built by a Vietnamese immigrant to the US who found that it was very hard to lose the Vietnamese accent. The Vietnamese language has a very strong accent. And so she knew perfect English, but pronouncing English language as it's spoken in the US, in business school was hard. So we built this app kind of around her own challenge. And it listens to your own accent and gives improvement advice and suggestions. Sort of like the opposite of Alexa and Siri, which are trying to normalize everybody's accents and hear just one canonical speech. This is AI that's actually differentiating everybody based on their accents and trying to look for the differences and the variances between what you're saying and standard colloquial English. So ELSA, really powerful tool for augmenting the instructor at scale, because improving accent's not something you typically get in a language class at a university. It's very hard to come by. It's very expensive. That's something a tutor might be able to give you, to Burr's point. But a large class, you're not going to have that chance for practicing your accent and improving over and over again. Number two is using the AI to make better human connections. Duke's using a tool called Protopia that we love. We're piloting it with our alumni, and it uses machine learning to read the profiles of all of our students and all of our alums. And so a student can ask a Blue Devil alum for advice on any topic of professional interest, extracurricular, something they want to pursue. And we mine the corpus of everything we know about our alumni to find them the perfect connection to make a mentor match. And then we push that, and it all runs through email. So it's kind of AI behind the scenes, doesn't even have an interface. And it's about doing automated email introductions for 170,000 alums who are spread around the world, who have interests and topics and expertise that cuts across all pursuits of human experience and knowledge. And how do you connect them with our 15,000 students on campus who have all these different interests? And Protopia is using this AI in this really humane, connective, networking kind of way, doing the things you might get from a really great, cocktail party that, somebody introduces you to somebody else, and that becomes really important. How do we do that, democratize that at scale? And the third one, I think, is something Stephanie mentioned, which is kind of starting with these more mundane micro tasks like Gradescope does, and we use Gradescope and love it for taking one piece of an assessment and just improving the workflow and productivity around that using computer vision. And Gradescope actually mitigates bias because it allows one TA to grade question number 3 for all the students in the class, rather than grading the whole exam for 1/3 of the class. And so it's improving the workflow of grading. It takes out some of this mundane challenge. It reduces the multiple choice kind of Scantron workflow, which nobody is satisfied with in education, and allows for more short answer questions. And I think because it's fairly micro, it's not promising to be the robot tutor in the sky. It's promising to do something fairly mundane and fairly straightforward. It's more manageable, and you can kind of build momentum by making progress on a challenge like that, showing value, giving faculty, instructors something of use to them. I think the ethical concerns are more manageable, and the efficacy is more immediately visible with products like that, and then build from there to that longer range vision that Nuno was talking about. That it's not a coincidence that the founders of Coursera were both leading AI researchers. That vision, I think, is clear to many of us in the field. The questions are, how do you get there? How do you take these steps so we do it in a way that's consistent with our values, consistent with the things that we want to hold on to in higher education?
Yeah, go ahead, Shravan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think great conversation. I think both Matthew and Stephanie hit on the key points here, and Nuno earlier as well. I think at the end of the day, when I think about who's the customer, what is the unmet need, and what are the pain points, and that's what I think you need to start going back to your question around adoption as well. I think you actually saying, the professor and the educator is actually part of the equation, part of the solution. So it's not a substitute, it's not a replacement. It's actually complementing, and how do we ensure that we can actually reduce some of the pain points that you're dealing with, and contextualizing the product experiences and solutions it relates to those pain points will lead to more adoption, but also seeing of the value from their perspective. One quick example is with all of the courses that we have, we call this course level student success dashboard in our degree programs as well. These are machine learning powered dashboards. I think one of the challenges is when you're dealing with a cohort size of 100, 500,000 people, you don't know which of these students are coming along for the journey. And if you think about it as a degree program, it just happens over 2 years. how long are they going to be engaged? They may be engaged for this course, they may not be getting engaged for the next course. So providing some predictive insights based on some of the activities that they've been undertaking throughout sort of that program experience can help the educators actually look at like, okay, these particular students, and going back to the other comment about like, if you can classify these particular segment of students are having this kind of a challenge, this segment of students are having this kind of a challenge, it becomes a lot more precision. It saves tremendous amount of time. It actually retains the students better, which means that higher, sort of the revenue, but also more students getting the outcome that the professors are looking to make. So that's just another example, but I think there are lots of these examples that can slowly add up to making the life of the educator better. But at the same time, I see that there's a lot of value on the learning side, which I think it's sort of this dual mindset can help us continue to move this forward.
I think it's such a rich series of answers that I'm hearing between Stephanie, Matthew, and Shravan, and I know Nuno and Burr, you would, I'm sure, join in. I'm not even going to try to synthesize, but certainly as an audience, I'm sure we could go many chapters with these sort of elements of where do we augment, where do we add precision, where do we allow the humans to be sort of the human in all of us experience to be preserved in the learning context of learning. I'm going to shift over. We've got about 8 minutes of open audience Q&A, and I want to first turn to you, Burr, but I want to then throw it open. There's a question here that just says, can we hear some concrete examples where machine learning with data has actually increased performance of some learning activity from X to Y? And Burr, I think if you're comfortable with it, I'd love to give you the first crack at this answer, and then we'll open it up for one or two other panelists.
Sure. So in general, this is a very challenging thing to do. So as a, Duolingo is like most companies, there are certain like key business metrics that they look at. Revenue is one of them. For apps, engagement and growth is another one. But for an educational app like Duolingo, learning is, of course, another one. About half of the company is focused solely on improving the learning experience. In order to improve it, you have to have something to measure. It's easy to look at other companies and say, how do they improve revenue or how do they improve engagement? But it's at the kind of scale we're operating at, directly to users, that's a difficult challenge. So we've tried many different things, and I referenced this efficacy study earlier. That's one of the approaches that we took, rather than trying to do short-term sort of, we run A/B tests or controlled experiments all the time, where half the users will get one version of the product and half will get a different version, and then we try to compare based on some metric. So we have this more long-term research, like year-long sort of research now, instead of an A/B test, which usually lasts a couple of weeks. Over the last few months, in January, we rolled out a new system we call Bird Brain, affectionately, inside the company, because our mascot is an owl. That is a large-scale item response model that can predict for any exercise and any user at any point in time. It'll predict the likelihood that they'll get that exercise correct, and we use that to tailor their experience and give them the exercises that they need to be, that are in the zone of proximal development. Like, these things are easy, they know it. These things are too hard, they're not ready for it yet. These are the things where they most need to develop. We've also found, as a byproduct of this system, we learn parameters about the items and what makes the items difficult, what grammatical concepts are part of the items that make them difficult. But we also get information about the users that are kind of pitted against the information about the items to make these predictions. And we found in recent research over the last quarter that those weights, those numbers that are learned for the users, are highly correlated with pre and post test things that we embed as embedded assessments. And they're also correlated with some other metrics that we look at. So there's a variety of learning metrics we have to look at. Time spent learning, time on task is another one that we look at. And we're also starting to look at kind of closing the loop between our learners learning English and the Duolingo English test. So using our own test as a benchmark for measuring learning. But those are some examples. We've actually, if you go to research.duolingo.com, we've published a few papers, some of which include results from these kinds of A/B tests for learning outcomes.
And Burr, maybe you could put that in the chat for participants to see any
yes.
links, and any other panelists. Any other panelists have examples they'd like to share?
I've mentioned the retention, the persistence rates that have improved with the schools that we serve. In Latin America, they've improved between 4 and 5 points after we've introduced these algorithms that are not that much different than what we were just discussing. The challenge is, and I think it's a challenge and at the same time is an opportunity, is that these do not work without human intervention in our particular case, because it's higher education. So if I identify that the student has a particular challenge with learning, let's say math, and the algorithm tells me that this student is having problems learning math, I still need a human to talk to this student and to help him. If I identify that a student has a challenge because he has been having financial problems, is not paying on time, I still need a human to talk to the student and present the options that he has in terms of scholarships or other type of financial support. So it's also related to the previous question, to the fact that it's not going to substitute in any of our lifetimes, it's not going to substitute the faculty, it's not going to substitute most of the people. What it will do is that it will give us tools to work better and to complement what is being done by humans. So if we talk about the faculty, they have two basic responsibilities. I believe Matthew mentioned these, which is content development and research, or maybe Stephanie. And responsibilities, they will still be there. And then AI will help them to work more efficiently and hopefully to work better within these two tasks that the faculty has.
Let me do this, everybody, because we're down to our last minute. I'm going to encourage our panelists to please put links on there. There was a request, Shravan, for that edX engagement report. If you have any link to that or can somehow post that. There are many topics I've not been able to cover. Of course, we would love to, but sure enough, we're running out of time. The ethics, the ability to open up that black box algorithm, further examples and ways in which adoption is happening or not. I would just say this. We're clearly covering a lot. We see examples where it's a solution in and of itself, upskilling, reskilling, improving equity, learning. Where does it come alongside? How do we preserve the ability for our expert faculty, teachers, content producers to be themselves? I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank ASU GSV. This has been a wonderful time to frankly begin, but clearly not end the discussion. I hope you all will blog or share additional learnings for our